Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Braunlick. I'm president of the Thomas Jefferson Institute. This is one of a series of public policy events held by the Institute, sponsored by the Wrench Pierce Family Foundation, and we're deeply appreciative of the support of the foundation and its leader, Lola Wrench. Some of these events are a webinar, some are a wonderful dinner in Tyson's Corner. This month, we have the honor of offering you two such events. On April 25th, we're hosting a dinner with Philip K. Howard, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Death of Common Sense, and of a new book about public employee unions called Not Accountable. Coming less than a month after a former teachers union organizer was elected as mayor of Chicago, the dinner is certain to offer insights into how government unions gain the political power they have, use it, and keep it. So I urge you to register when you receive your next invitation, which should be tomorrow morning. One note before introducing tonight's speaker: we will try our best to get to all the questions you have. Please put your questions into the Q&A section, not the chat room. I will try to monitor both areas, but when in doubt, I'll be checking the Q&A section. Now, this is the second time we've had Ambassador Gilmore with us. When we last discussed tonight's topic 14 months ago, shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, at the 1-year mark, more than law enforcement agencies had investigated more than 65,000 war crimes and crimes of aggression over the past year, including the deaths of more than 9,000 civilians, including 500 children, the wounding of 12,000 other civilians, including more than 900 children. 14,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped and taken to Russia, where their history is thrown down the memory hole and personal data is changed. 75,000 civilian infrastructure facilities have been damaged or destroyed, including 60,000 residential buildings, more than 2,200 schools and educational facilities, and more than 400 medical institutions. But what we need to discuss is about what is happening in Ukraine is not because of the barbarism of Russia or even the security of Ukraine, but because of the long-term impact this may and will have on the future security of the United States, and as we've seen, the impact on our relations with other states, such as Iran and China. And no one is better suited to offer you this background than the former ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Ambassador James S. Gilmore III. Many years ago, a friend of mine who is a bit of a foreign policy expert himself had the pleasure of sitting next to Jim Gilmore on the dais at a conservative event, and I asked him how the conversation went. And he responded he was very proud of his accomplishments in the state. But what really got him excited and engaged was to talk about national security and international affairs. Most knowledgeable governor I've met on those issues is what he told me. And I think it's a key reason President Trump nominated Jim Gilmore for the ambassadorship. Known to most Virginians as former governor and attorney general, his long interest and expertise in international and security affairs began during his early days working as a counterintelligence agent in the early 70s, earning a degree from the University of Virginia in International Relations, Russian Area Studies. From 1999 to 2003, Jim Gilmore served as chairman of the congressional panel known as the Gilmore Commission to assess America's capabilities to respond to a terrorist attack. A candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 2016, prior to his ambassadorship, he served as president and CEO of the American Opportunity Foundation, working to shape the discussions around American society and offer conservative solutions that promise prosperity, national security, and American values. Those of you who are privileged to live in the Richmond area no doubt can hear him. I think it's every Tuesday on the John Reed Show. And he is, I know, a popular figure among a great many places in Richmond to talk about this issue. We are delighted to welcome Ambassador Jim Gilmore. Mr. Ambassador, welcome.
Good, Chris. Thank you very much. It's great to have a chance to be here and to speak to your listeners here with the Thomas Jefferson Institute. And I'm looking forward to some back and forth over the next 45, 50 minutes where we can have some conversation because it's a very key issue. So let me start by saying that the one reason why I accept this speech and many other speeches is because I'm aware that I'm speaking to leaders, people who are influential. They move about in other circles. They have a chance to be noticed and to be listened to. And that's why I want to discuss this issue. And that's why I'm giving speeches, and that's why I'm here today. The second thing that I want to say is that I recognize that this is a debatable issue today. And so as a result of that, I'm not here to tell your viewers what they're supposed to think. I'm here to tell them what I think and why I think it, and therefore what I believe should be persuasive. But I recognize there are different people who have different points of view. So let me start off by saying what the OSCE is. By the way, you're right. I am giving a lot of talks and speeches, and I'm doing it on WRVA radio. And you're right, but it's Thursday morning at 8:30, and that's and people can go on the internet anywhere in the world and tune in WRVA live and listen to it at about 8:30. So let me just start by talking about the OSCE, because when I was asked by the Trump administration to become a United States ambassador, they said, how would you feel about being ambassador to the OSCE? And I said, well, what's that? I don't know what that is. Never heard of it. And they said it's an international organization headquartered in Vienna, Austria, that deals with national security issues of basically the entire Northern Hemisphere. It's 57 countries. Everybody in Europe, all the Scandinavian countries, all the Baltic countries, all the Balkan countries, Russia is in it, Ukraine is in it, all the Western European countries, and it crosses the Atlantic and sweeps into the United States and Canada as well. So it's a big organization. It's based upon the Helsinki Accords of 1976. So your listeners, if you get a chance after the talk, if you want to really read some more, you can read about the Helsinki Accords, which were entered into basically between Russia and America, but many other countries as well. And it was trying to create some sense of stability in Europe. Even under Brezhnev at that time, Russia was really a different place. They were seeking stability so they could grow their country and also secure their empire, which of course they failed to do, because the trade-off was the Western countries sought openness, newspapers, magazines, the ability for people behind the Iron Curtain to travel. And the result, though, was that people behind the Iron Curtain became exposed to Western ideas and values. And the result ultimately was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Helsinki Accords remained in effect, although Vladimir Putin today is trying to undo them. And they are still a powerful basis for the OSCE. So that gives you some background for that. Why don't you put up a slide, just by way of illustration, slide 1, if you could. You got it, Chris?
I think so.
There we go. It's coming up. Okay, so go to the next slide, if you would, slide number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the residence of the United States ambassador to the OSCE in Vienna, Austria. And the next slide that was just put up, that is the Hofburg Palace in downtown Vienna. And that is where the OSCE meets. It's not as famous as the United Nations building, but everybody in Europe knows what it was. It was the Habsburg Palace in downtown Vienna, Austria. So this gives you a feel for what this place is really about and what the United States ambassador does. Just go to the next slide, if you would. After I left the OSCE, this is just a picture giving you a feel for what the meeting room is like. You can go to the next one also, and we can just go through this pretty quickly. And then the next one, that's the room where the OSCE meets. These people above are the simultaneous translators in Italian, German, English, French, Russian. And then the next slide, Chris, just go to illustrate. After I left the ambassadorship, which I did when President Biden was elected, he pulled all the Republicans that were ambassadors out worldwide and sent us all home. That's not uncommon, by the way. That's pretty typical. I did something similar to that when I became governor of Virginia, as a matter of fact. But then after that, in May of 21, I was invited to go by the American Foreign Policy Council and lead a delegation to Kyiv. And this is Kyiv. Those are our guides right there that showed us around. And I had a chance to visit with every ministry there, every security ministry, every economic ministry. You know, it's very interesting, Chris, when I was there, I actually asked every minister that I met with and all of his staff, and I said, look, we all recognize that Russia is just right next door. Sooner or later, they're going to potentially get aggressive. If they were to invade you, what would you do? And every Ukrainian that I met, everyone said, look, we are not Russians. We are Ukrainians. We speak a different language. We have a different history, really. except for the Soviet conquest, if you will. And we are not Russians, and we don't intend to be a part of Russia. So if they invade, we will fight. And at that time, I said, I don't really believe you because you're not big enough to really fight the Russians. And I said, how about that point? And they said, look, they threw up their hands and they said, this is the only country we got. So we will fight. And of course, history has proved that they did. And of course, as we now know, a year later, in February of 2022, war broke out. Putin invaded. And now you can go to the next slide. This is a lot. It'll come up there. That's a lot of what Ukraine looks like now. And that's the result of this Putin's invasion. It's an aggression. Let me be clear about something. Let me begin by addressing something that's maybe on the minds of some of your viewers. Some people have said, well, it's really all our fault. You hear that all the time. You even hear it among conservatives. It's all our fault. We never should have extended NATO, as far as we did. The Russians are right to lash back. They're right to do these things. Baloney. That's not what's going on. What's going on is Vladimir Putin is trying to reassemble the old Russian Empire, or the Soviet Empire, if you will. That's what he's trying to do. He cannot do that unless he joins up Belarus, and he's gone a long way there because of the dictator there. But Ukraine is fighting, and he can't create this new empire unless he conquers Ukraine. And of course, the second thing is he's doing it, as Chris said at the beginning, through atrocity and murder and kidnapping of children, which is a war crime. And he's really setting a new standard for the world. Civilization doesn't count in Vladimir Putin's world. I think that is what really has to be remembered, that we're changing the world by watching what is going on. But Putin's long-term goal there is quite clear, and he's very determined to do it. And when he invaded, he really gave very few options for the West. Right now, for example, I hear other conservatives say, well, it's time, how's it end? The time has come to get to the negotiating table. The U.S. should force them to the negotiating table and end this. Well, of course, it's up to the Ukrainians whether they want to fight or whether they want to negotiate or whether they want to surrender. It's up to them, not us. But as long as they want to fight, America has a stake in making sure that they can fight. But the problem, of course, when he invaded Ukraine the way he did, he cut off a lot of options. Because now if there's a ceasefire, if there's a negotiated settlement that leaves Russia in place in eastern Ukraine, then Russia has won. And he's proven that aggression works, that murder works, that atrocity works. That is not the kind of world that we can live in. Furthermore, he says NATO is a threat. Look, I was there for 2 years in Vienna. I was working with all these countries. I was working with the NATO countries who are a part of the OSCE. We all know NATO is not a threat. It is a defensive organization. If they were going to strike into Russia, they'd have done it over the last 70 years. NATO is not a threat to Russia and never was, and that's not what's going on here. It's a nice excuse to tell the Russian people, to fool the Russian people, but that's not what's going on. Now, let me point another thing out. There is a duality to American national security. One is that we want the United States to be safe, and the other is the legitimacy of our values. The U.S. is always creating these two different values. The threat that we see right now, and I want to be real clear about this, because this is exactly why the United States has a stake in this. If Russia is able to conquer Ukraine through atrocity and warfare and aggression and succeed, they will be sending a message worldwide, but particularly into Europe, that the bear next door, the aggressor next door, has to be taken into consideration in all of Europe's foreign policy and all of their domestic politics. It will color things. It's perfectly clear that Putin would like to extend a sphere of influence back into Eastern Europe and really influence Western Europe. And that is dangerous. The United States has an existential stake in Europe. The United States has never allowed a foreign aggressor to dominate Europe. That is not in the American interest. It is not consistent with America's safety. And that is exactly what the result of this will be. Now, that the other thing is this, and this is kind of hard, particularly for realists, people, and I'm one of those, but well, not exactly, but I'm a realist, but I'm also a person that understands America's values. America cannot live in a world in which dictatorship and tyranny means that the world means that there will be a knock at the door in the middle of the night, to be hauled away to a cellar someplace, beaten and tortured and murdered. That is not the world that the United States can live in. And that is the world right now that Putin intends to, has in Russia, intends to extend into Ukraine, and then beyond that through threat and intimidation. I want to make a comment about the beginning of this war. I see this as largely a poker game. Putin was all in on this poker game. He knew exactly what he was trying to do, and it was his big moment. This was his chance to reassemble the old Russian Empire and to place himself as the greatest Russian in history. Against that, he had to look and see what was going to be the Western response. Well, let me just point out a few things. George W. Bush said that he met with Putin and he looked into his eyes and saw his soul. That was sending a message to Putin that the United States really wasn't serious about stopping his ultimate agenda. Obama, during that time that Obama was president, at one time he gave a speech and he was heard off camera saying to Medvedev, the president at that time of Russia, "Don't you worry, when I get reelected, tell Vladimir that I'll have a much more flexibility to work with him." That was sending a message to Putin that the United States was not serious about stopping his ultimate goals. Finally, I want to talk a minute about Biden for just a moment. Biden made at least 5 mistakes. He met with Putin and gave him the dignity of a summit with the president of the United States, which I wrote he should not have done. President Trump put sanctions on Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Biden came in and took them off. The New START treaty was under negotiation. I was in Vienna when that negotiation was going on. The United States wanted to extract some removal of Russian tactical weapons from the European theater. But Biden came in and just extended the treaty, sending a message to Putin that we weren't serious. The Afghanistan debacle that happened there was demonstrating the United States was prepared to pull back and withdraw. And then finally, there was a press conference. I saw it with my own eyes, Chris, and listeners, I saw it with my own eyes. The president was asked in a press conference, what happens if Putin does an invasion into Ukraine? And his answer, well, it just depends on what kind of invasion it is. Maybe it'll be okay if there's just a slight incursion. At that point, I knew that Putin was reading the poker cards and saying the West will not respond. And so he pulled the trigger and he did the invasion. I thought it was inevitable at that point. Now, he's lost that gamble because overnight the West has awakened. President Biden has awakened. And they're supporting the Ukrainians and have been supporting the Ukrainians since that time, for the past year. Now, I agree that President Biden should be doing more, relentlessly and dramatically. I think this is because Biden was intimidated at the beginning. We've never really been in a war before with a nuclear power, and Biden started doing step-up baby steps. But the time has come now to recognize that everything is at stake here. The war is here. The second point that I want to make to your listeners is this. The war is, in fact, here in the United States. What we have seen is the rise of this neo-isolationism in the United States, and particularly in the Republican Party, among certain Republican leaders, some of whom want to be president of the United States. Neo-isolationism is the greatest danger to Ukraine, but it is the greatest danger to the United States. I don't know why people can't read history and just recognize exactly what history has demonstrated to us. If we pull back, if isolationists carry the Russian message, if the Republican Party becomes an isolationist party and they abandon Ukraine, there are big consequences. So let me address that and then I'll stop. Here's the fundamental point that I want to make to the listeners tonight before we go to Q&A. The question I hear all the time is, so what? Who cares? What if they steal children? They're not our children. What if they destroy people? What difference does it make? What difference does it make? Here's my answer. It is the United States interest that is at stake here. More so than even Ukraine, even the destruction that we're seeing there. It is the United States interest that is at stake here. I said to you a little while ago, the United States has never allowed a hostile power to come under to draw their influence over Europe. Europe is an essential element to the life and safety and security of the United States. The United States has never allowed a hostile power to control the Western Pacific. And that is the danger here. If we pull back and send the message of isolationism, we will, the poker cards will be read in China too. And then we will trigger an invasion in Taiwan, which will intimidate the Australians, the Japanese, the Philippines, and ultimately abandon the United States. Ultimately, because of that influence, at least they'll have to begin to change their policy. We have never allowed Europe and the Western Pacific to be dominated by hostile powers at the same time. That becomes an existential concern and danger to the United States of America. Ultimately, I believe that the Chinese and the Russians have decided that now is the time to remake the world, to have their dominance in Asia, their dominance in Europe, and the kind of culture that means to knock on the door in the middle of the night, to be drawn away to a cellar, to be beaten and murdered. That is the message that they're sending in China. That is the message they're sending in Russia. I'm telling your listeners, they cannot live with us as long as we are a beacon of liberty, as long as we follow the Reagan precepts that brought down the Berlin Wall. They cannot achieve their goals. The United States ultimately is the block of that, and they can't live with us. And then the second point is we can't live with them either. If that's the goal, and that's what they're trying to create, ultimately, the United States would be drawn in to an insular economy, unable to trade with these dictatorships. The culture of the world would become much more accepting of these dictatorships and tyrannies, which ultimately would influence the politics and culture of the United States, as it already is. These are the dangers, the existential dangers to the United States. Without allies, without standing up for our values, the U.S. itself is at danger. And that is my message to your listeners, and why I believe that we have to stand with the Ukrainians today. And I'll tell you now that this is a small cost to the United States, a big cost to the Ukrainian people who are paying in their blood and their suffering. But I'll tell you, it's a small cost right now to the people of the United States against what's coming if we walk away from this. So, Chris, those are my first remarks.
Well, thank you, and there certainly can. Are there any more slides up here? We should.
We'll go to the next. So we'll just run through them real quick. There's only a couple more for your illustration. This was President Putin meeting with President Biden, and that, of course, increased the prestige for President Putin at that time, and also sent a message that the U.S., I think, was not serious. And the next slide shows exactly where Ukraine is. Well, all these countries and all the countries off the map are in the OSCE, but that is where Ukraine is located, of course. You may notice Moldova over there. There are already Russian troops occupying Moldova, part of Moldova, on the other side of Ukraine. But what you'd also notice right now is that Belarus at this point is beginning to fall under the sway of Russia in the north. The big leader right now in Europe is Poland. They are the real leaders of the fight against Ukraine. They're supplying money, they're supplying weapons, they're sending tanks, and they're taking care of the refugees. Slovakia is as well. Hungary is more problematic every day. I do not understand that. One of my good friends is the ambassador in Hungary. When I was in Vienna, we never had this kind of pushback from Hungary, but there's a risk here that if we don't stand strong, that Hungary could go the wrong way. Romania is quite strong. They get exactly what's going on. And even Bulgaria, which historically had been a Russian ally. Georgia, by the way, was also invaded down to your right there. Go to the next slide also. This is the world that we live in. And I want everybody to keep this. The remarks I'm making, Chris, today is I want your listeners to keep in mind the entire global big picture, because that's what's going on here. If the United States is in danger in the Pacific and in danger in Europe, we are in danger. We're in danger economically. We won't be able to put the force together to be able to protect ourselves or our allies. Our allies will fall away from us, and things will get pretty bad in the future if this comes up. I'll go to the next slide. I think we're almost done. There are our two guys. We can't allow these two guys to join up in an aggression, either in Taiwan or in Ukraine, that will begin that process of creating tyranny across the rest of the world. And the next slide, that's how you reach me. So your listeners can write this down if you will. If you want to reach me, send an email to gilmoreambassador@gmail.com. It's down at the bottom. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. But I want to be sure I say this because I never remember to do this. you've got your listeners on the line. I'd like to engage with them. I'd like to continue to do this. So please send me your email to gilmoreambassador@gmail.com, and you'll begin to see things both on my writings and also on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Well, as you know, we are recording this, and so we will send to everyone both a link to the final recording and send them this information as well so they can reach you directly. Thank you so much. It's a lively discussion. Let me remind everyone that please put your questions into the Q&A section, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. I'm not quite in order, but let me you mentioned China. Richard indicates Zelensky is a ruthless and corrupt dictator and petty tyrant. Ukraine serves no American interest other than to act as a U.S. proxy against Russia. China is our threat, not Russia. Do you agree? And to that extent, I guess my other part of that question, my take on that question would be, aren't they working together? Didn't Iran get into the act? Aren't there alliances that aren't being reported very heavily in some of the newspapers?
Well, there are. And the real danger to the United States is a combination of Russia, China, and Iran, as we know, with North Korea over there probably as a diversion and a distraction. Look, I want to address this. The conventional wisdom today has been that China is the principal threat. And, over the long run, maybe they are because they just have so many people and they're using their people for industrialization, which creates economic power, which then, of course, creates military power. So I'm not saying in this talk that China is not a long-term problem. I do believe, based upon what I'm saying, that the Chinese are smarter than the Russians. I think they're watching very closely here. They don't want to make the same mistake that Putin made and to launch a war at this point in the Pacific if the West is going to be resolute. So I think that China is a longer-term problem that we have to address, and I think that your listener is correct to take note of that. I do not, however, think that they are the principal problem right now. China might be a problem in several years. Russia's a problem today, right now, and I actually was saying that before the invasion, as a matter of fact. And that's because they're more reckless, and they're taking more risks in order to try to achieve their goals. Look. I have no reason today to certify or guarantee or be a guarantor of Ukraine or any of its people or any of its government. When I was there, they were informing me that they were working against corruption, the same corruption that was inherited from the old Soviet Union, that they're trying to be better. But here's the most important answer to your listener's question. The most important strategic point is that Ukraine stands between us and the domination of Europe. I'm not saying that the Red Army is going to go and invade France. What I am saying is that if they succeed in what they're doing right now, they intimidate the rest of Europe. Other people understand this. Look at this. All of my life, all of our lives, Finland and Sweden have been neutral. Now, all of a sudden, they're willing and wanting to join NATO. Why? Because they understand exactly what I'm saying in this talk. So the point is this. I'm not saying Zelensky's a perfect person, but the goal here is not to get in and remake Ukraine in our model. We want our values to be as strong as possible, but they always are across the world. But the key, the threat is not Ukraine. The threat is Russia, and they're demonstrating it every day. It's really funny. I'll stop here with that answer by saying this. We're the luckiest people in the world, Americans. We're luckier than we deserve to be. We're not expending one soldier or any blood or suffering any destruction yet or any of those kinds of things. Otto von Bismarck said that God looks after drunks and fools in the United States of America. And I think he's right. We're the luckiest people in the world that the Ukrainians decided to not fold up and become part of the Russian Empire, but instead decided to stand up for themselves.
Dennis asks the question, should the U.S. be as involved as it is in Ukraine if the Europeans aren't more involved, especially since Macron has apparently thrown the U.S. under the bus when it comes to Taiwan?
I think that's a great question, and it's today's news. When I was ambassador there, I got my hands on a speech that Macron gave to all of his ambassadors who met in Paris at one point. And I thought it was a terrible speech, just terrible. Macron's got this French weird thing going where they want to be independent. They want to be leaders of Europe. Frankly, as I said in my opening remarks, the real leaders of Europe at this point are the Poles, if you want to know the truth. They get the drill. They're right there on the border with Belarus. They understand what's going on. But the French are like that. But one of the ministers, I think the Treasury, Minister of Finance, was on this afternoon and was at pains to say, no, we're still allies of the United States. I can also say that when I met with the Quad, which is the French, the Germans, the British, and the Americans, every week when I was in Vienna, I never had any doubt about the French, the Germans, or especially the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the very best ally we've got in the world still. But the point is this: I don't like what Macron said because it's unpolitical. He basically was trying to make a case for some sort of French independence. The truth is that France is independent. So is Germany. So is the United Kingdom. So is the United States. Every country is sovereign. That's the way that the world is built. The key is, do we have alliances when we need it? And, I believe that the United States leadership is going to be strong. If our isolationist friends take over, the French and the Germans and even the British will begin to lose faith in American leadership. And then at that point, what I'm talking about is the potential danger to the United States as our allies and our friends across the world lose faith in us.
Karen asks, how can we justify a blank check for supporting Ukraine when we have such needs and debt here?
Another great question that I hear all the time. Often it's how come we send $40 billion to support Ukraine when we could be sending it to the southern border? Does anybody on this call seriously think that President Biden would send that $40 billion to the southern border? We know he wouldn't, and he wouldn't send the money for any of our essential needs either. But the point is this, that's really not the best answer. The best answer is that this is a national emergency of the United States of America, and we're getting by cheap. And the fact of the matter is that the United States is the most powerful economy in the world. We're a $42.5 trillion economy, and we're in a position to do more than one thing at a time. Also meant to respond, by the way, the U.S. is supporting Ukraine, to be sure, but the European Union, we've been sending about $44 billion at this point, plus some financial aid. But the European Union has sent $30 billion, and the individual countries have sent more. And so it's a rough balance between U.S. aid and all the countries of Europe on the other side. In terms of economies, the U.S. has the biggest economy in the world, and we can do more. The question is it our interest to do more? By gross domestic product commitment on this war, the biggest country that is sending the most relative to their GDP is, in fact, Estonia. And after that, Latvia. And after that, Poland. And after that, Lithuania. The United States by GDP is 14th in terms of its commitment relative to its financial power. So these things have got to be recognized and kept in some reasonable perspective. So does that answer the question? Did I get off?
I think so. Yeah, I do think it does. Alan asks, is it your view that the U.S. is now at war with Russia?
Yes. When I was there in Vienna, we were discussing the issue of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare means that you use all the elements of your national power in a conflict. We, in fact, for years now have been in conflict with the Russians, and not by our choice, by the way. In fact, if I can say so, I think the United States was naive through the Bush, Obama, and even the Trump administrations, and certainly under this administration. We started off very naive. Our hope was that we can, in fact, be partners with the Russians, that we could join together with the Russians, that the Russians would. We saw in 1991, the Russians actually turned to the West and turned to more democracy. It was Putin who slammed all that back down again. But unfortunately, we have to recognize that we're in a conflict. Now, we're not in a traditional classic conflict with the Russians and don't want to be in one where we send our tanks and our tank officers and our soldiers. We're not in that. And we're lucky that we're not in that. And we don't want to be in that. but we are in a conflict, and we may as well recognize that we are, because our interests are at stake here. And the Russians know that. They know what they're doing. They're trying to diminish the capacity of the United States and our values and our leadership and that of our friends and allies. They know that. Now, we're not going to declare war, because that's not in our interest. It's not in their interest to declare war on us either. And that's why this is such a complicated situation. But the best thing for us to do right now is to keep this going, that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine.
Along those lines of declaring war, Donald asks if Ukraine was provided nuclear weapons for this conflict, would Putin back off?
I think that's a risk that we ought not to be taking. I think it's a risk that Putin so far has chosen not to engage in. Actually, he's threatening nuclear weapons, which, by the way, makes nuclear weapons in the hands of the Russians an offensive weapon, not a defensive weapon. Because by basically saying, if you attack us, we'll use nuclear weapons, he's preventing anybody from attacking him, which means he can then tear up Ukraine, kidnap their children, murder their civilians, all with impunity. So the question is, if we gave them nuclear weapons, what would happen? I don't know. And that is a risk that I think that we are not yet, it's not yet necessary to run that risk. I think Putin won't use his nuclear weapons. And I think that the Ukrainians can, in fact, push the Russians out of Ukraine if they have appropriate support from the West, especially the United States.
You talked a moment ago about value systems and values in the United States, and questions come up. How do we turn our youth around when 80% of those surveyed support socialism in the U.S.? And I know a lot of folks have looked at the Wall Street Journal poll that was a week or so ago that showed a precipitous drop in things like going to church and patriotism. It's a little off topic, but maybe it's not. How do we turn it around?
Well, it's very dangerous if the culture of the United States goes away from our traditional love of country and our willingness to provide international leadership. Then yes, the entire safety of the United States is at stake. And yes, we are seeing the American left today, through its domination of the Democratic Party, its domination of the media, trying to change the culture of the United States of America. You know, Chris, I guess that's why we're conservatives, because we're holding up the flag and trying to keep the Reagan years alive so that we all know that we can come out of this better. Education is a big issue, and we're seeing it under discussion right now nationwide. The COVID, of course, was a dramatic problem for education, but it's not just that. It's the left-wing culture that is a problem for education in this country. But I think that that's the mission and goal of leadership of us conservatives to do the right thing. Chris, I want to say one thing very quickly, too, for your listeners who are probably thinking about this. There are a lot of different strains of international relations thought in the United States of America. So I want to be clear with all of you all who are thinking, well, Gilmore is just a neocon. I am not a neocon. I didn't like the neocon policy. That was where we chose to invade other countries with our soldiers and then remake those countries under our values and our politics. We saw that in Afghanistan, which was a failure. We saw it in Iraq, which was a dramatic failure. I am not a neocon, but I do believe that we should be trying to evolve the world to more of our democratic and values. And by the way, that includes in the United States of America. I'm not a neocon. I'm not a liberal internationalist either. I don't believe in surrendering our sovereignty to anyone, but I do believe in American leadership because I've seen it. The United States is relied upon by other people who will support us when the chips are down, if they believe in American leadership. And that's why the neo-isolationists, I'm not an isolationist either. That's why it's so dangerous, because if the U.S. draws back and ceases to be involved in the world, they're kidding themselves. This is not the world that we live in. We live in an international world, and we can do that. And I believe, by the way, conservative internationalism is the correct way to go. And I can, of course, describe what that is. But first, I want to tell you, listeners, what I'm not.
Fair enough. Thank you. Virginia asks your thoughts on a discussion about an Asian version of NATO with members that would include U.S., India, Japan, and Australia.
I think it would be a good thing if we could make that come to pass. And what we're seeing right now is the emergence of the possibility of something like that. The Japanese get the joke. They always did. And they're now beginning to raise the possibility that they're going to be prepared to defend themselves instead of just relying upon the United States alone. But they're not going to do very well against China if they think that we don't have their backs, quite literally, in the Pacific Ocean. The Philippines, of course, moved away from us and now are moving much further back and allowing us to have our bases in the Philippines because they see what's going on in the South China Sea. I went to Australia a couple of years ago and met with them and talked about their foreign policy. They're moving our way. The submarine deal with the British and the Americans and the Australians is a dramatic message that's going to the Chinese. People are waking up in the Pacific. So I think there's a possibility of this. And in fact, you don't even have to have a treaty. I think what we're seeing emerge right now without the necessity of a treaty is the awakening of the Western Pacific. But that's because they know that America is leading. I say again, if America draws back with this crazy isolationist idea we're seeing emerge in the Republican Party, everybody's in danger. And there will be a genuine world war somewhere up the road as China and Russia continue to develop their aggression. And that's not what we want. Jim Gilmore is not about seeking war. It's about preventing a really big war in the immediate future if we do this wrong.
We've talked a lot about the geopolitical international relationship. Dennis asked the question, what's your assessment of the current military situation in Ukraine?
Well, I'm not a military general officer, and we should look to them for as much as they're willing to say and to explain to us about what's going on. My role and life role is as a politician, and I think I understand the big picture and the strategy and the politics. And frankly, it's all politics. Even military is politics, as we all know. But what's going on right now is the danger of a stalemate. I say the danger of a stalemate. Well, one thing is that Putin probably can't conquer Ukraine today. He tried to take over Kyiv and he failed. And he probably can't move much further west right now with his depleted situation in Russia. And his soldiers are mostly dead. And I think he's having real problems with that. But right now there's a stalemate. But I believe that if the United States and its allies continue to provide the Ukrainians the wherewithal that they need, it is possible that they may, in fact, push the Russians out of Ukraine. That can happen. That can happen. And I think that the interesting issue, of course, is Crimea, which everybody thinks is Russian. It really traditionally has only been occupied by Russia for a short while and other people. But the point is that in the Budapest Memorandum, if you all want to look that up, the United States urged the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons at the fall of the Soviet Union. And they did, with a guarantee, the guarantee that their borders would be respected. And that guarantee was issued by Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. And that included included Crimea. When the Russians went in under Obama and just took over Crimea, if you look at it, they were actually pretty tentative about it. They didn't really send their soldiers in. They sent in little green men in unmarked uniforms because if there was a stand up against them, they wanted to be able to run away tuck their tails without being embarrassed. Unfortunately, nobody did anything. So that emboldened, empowered Putin along the line that he's trying to go.
Years ago, certainly when I was in high school and college, at this point, everybody would have been yelling about what the United Nations should do. And so Glenn asks the question, where is the United Nations in all this?
Well, we conservatives, I think, have always been suspicious of the United Nations, and so am I. The OSCE, by the way, is a similar organization, but it can't move troops. NATO can move troops. But the OSCE is a platform for diplomacy and messaging, which is a powerful political tool, by the way. Messaging is important. When I was at OSCE, I was sending a very strong message on behalf of President Trump and the United States of strength. And I think that message was being heard in Moscow. I'm going to be very direct with your question, which is,
where is the United Nations in all this? Are they taking a role?
The United Nations is not capable of handling a war involving one of the five powers. They can't do anything because of the Russian veto and the Chinese veto. And I think that what's really going on here is this. If we want to have a forum where we can, in fact, have governments talk to each other and share some values, and the values of the OSCE are the same thing as the International Statement on Human Rights. If we want to have an organization like that at all, it's going to have to be one where there's an agreement worldwide as to certain principles and values. That's what the United Nations is based upon. Russia right now and China is also, they are rejecting the principles of the United Nations. I think the United Nations is unable to act. I think it exposes the fact that the United Nations is not capable of dealing with this kind of conflict. And it means that the United States had better sit up, enjoy its sovereignty, enjoy its allies and its friends, and stand up for the West, because the United Nations is not going to be able to do it.
Bill cuts to the chase. You get to do one thing. So if we get to do one thing, what is the single best thing the U.S. could do to push back on Russia and China?
Demonstrate resolve. That is the one thing that we can do. It goes without saying that we have to send this small amount of money relative to the American budget and the American GDP. We have to do that in order for them to be able to survive and to be able to push the Russians back. That goes without saying, but that's not the principal thing. The principal thing is resolve, the American messaging, sending the word that we're not going to quit, sending the message and getting into Putin's mind the truth, which is that he cannot succeed, sending it to the Russian people. I was doing that while I was at OSCE. The one thing that we can do is to demonstrate resolve. And that's where the Republican Party today, my party, that I represented as governor of Virginia, is on the wrong path. Now, let me be clear. The neo-isolationists in the Republican Party are not a majority. The Reagan conservatives are the majority in the Republican Party today, in foreign policy and domestic policy. But if this continues to go, Putin will look at this and say, well, I guessed right. I can see it going on right now. The Americans are going to quit. They're saying so. They're saying that they don't want any part of the world. They want to draw back. They're short-sighted. They're ignorant. That's what they're saying. And so then he will continue. But right now, the one answer is American resolve. We not only have to send the message of resolve, we have to be resolved. And if we do that, this can come out right.
If nothing else, Putin's a poker player, and you can't really tell what's going on in his head from his face for sure. He's got no tells that I know of. We had said that this would end at 7:45. Have you got a little more time to spend with us?
I do. I'm very respectful of your listeners, and I'm happy to respond to their questions.
Fair enough. Thank you. So Sabina asks, does Ukraine have a Russian ethnic population who wants to join Russia? Obviously, they could just move to Russia, and their presence doesn't justify invading the country.
Well, Sabina answers the question correctly. There are people who speak Russian. There are people who have a wistful desire to be part of a new Soviet empire. But the fact is that we live in a world with borders. We live in a world with guaranteed borders. The principles of the OSCE are several. It is that we live within our borders, that borders are respected, that we don't march armies across borders in Europe and conquer people. We don't do that. That's the principles of the world. We're going to have openness, respect for human rights. Those are the principles of the OSCE. Putin is shattering that right now by his aggression, to be sure. So that is a part of the problem. So now look, sure, there are people that are Russian that live in Ukraine. If they want to be part of Russia, it's not that tough for them to move. The Russians would be happy to have them. But the fact is that there are a lot of people in eastern Ukraine that don't want to be part of Russia. And, one time I talked to my friend, the Ukrainian ambassador, while I was in Vienna, and I shouldn't reveal this, but I will. I quietly said to him, hey, look, well, why don't you just give up Crimea and tell the Russians they need to get out of this influence in eastern Ukraine? Why don't you just do that and call it a day? And he said, the Crimeans are our citizens. They're our people. How do we abandon them? And if we abandon them, aren't we sending a message we're prepared to abandon other people within our country? So that begin to tumble you downhill. Also, something else I learned while I was ambassador. Europe is chock-a-block full of ethnic people that they've got this sense of ethnic loyalty. But we live in a world where people live within borders. they're free to move. That was one of the principles of the OSCE and the Helsinki Accords. People can go. You don't justify aggression. To the contrary, you condemn it. So Sabino is right. The folks can go if they want to go. They're free to go. Nobody's holding them in place.
Helen asked the question, given the current list of presidential candidates, does Governor Gilmore see the next U.S. president continuing the support of Ukraine against Russia, both economically and militarily?
I believe so, because what I'm saying here today is self-evident. As time goes on and the debate for the presidency goes on, people are going to understand that America giving in to tyranny worldwide in the two principal theaters is not something we're going to be able to do. So I don't care what any of the candidates are saying right now, and I'm not committed to any of the candidates yet, but I know that an isolationist philosophy is one that I can't support. I know I can't support that. But I believe that as time goes on, people are going to understand this, and the Republican president is going to be looking more to the history of Ronald Reagan and the success we had and the fall of the Soviet Union, the drop of the Iron Curtain, the tear down this wall, the principles and values that Reagan stood for, and we as Americans and conservatives stand for. And I believe that that's what's going to prevail ultimately in the presidential election.
Let's talk a little bit about trade. One of the questions is, why should we continue to trade with Russia, China, or anyone else who trades with India, India, for example?
Well, India is a difficult case. They're playing both sides. They're trading with the enemy, but they're militarily working with us. So they're a big country, and they have to be brought our way. But to be direct on the answer, I don't think we should be trading with Russia or China. I don't. I think that that history has demonstrated that it doesn't work. Let me be clear about this. Here's what we did as Americans. We followed a philosophy for a long time, starting with Nixon and Kissinger, in which we said, trade is going to win out. It will democratize China. Trade will civilize Russia. We will do better if we do this. We will spread our values through organizations like the OSCE, and we're going to make the world a better place. And in 1991, it almost worked. Even at Tiananmen Square, while it didn't have a hope of working, it showed the world that there are Chinese people that do want human rights and values and liberty. Those people do exist. They're crushed right now by tyranny. But the point is that that didn't work. And I believe that we are only waking up to it right now, Chris. We're only waking up to it right now, beginning to figure it out. But I don't think that we can be trading with the enemy, building up their economies, and at the same time prepared to meet the crisis that is coming upon us worldwide.
Let me combine a couple of questions from Andrew, which came one right after another. Are we still in charge? Or is our foreign policy now struggling with the Chinese to take a footstep in international policy, especially in the Middle East? And are the Russians falling in the swamp like they did in Afghanistan? Are they facing another one of those?
What, in Ukraine?
In Ukraine.
Yeah. I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine yet. A lot of it depends upon the Americans and our leadership. The question was, are we still in charge? Well, I don't think America has ever tried to carry out its national policy by being in charge. That's Macron saying, well, I don't want America to be in charge. Well, when I was ambassador, I never suggested to any of the 56 countries in the OSCE that America was in charge of them. In fact, the neocons tried to put us in charge of a couple of countries, and it's failed. And I think we should learn that lesson. I don't think America wants to be in charge, but I want to be loud and clear about this, Chris. America is always the big player in the room. Do not lose heart in this. Do not lose faith in America. My direct experience is that people look to America for leadership. And as long as America is there and has resolve and stands by its principles and stands by its allies, the allies will be with us. But if we move back and come home and we become isolationists and insular, in the long run, it's the destruction of America. But before we destroy America, we'll destroy the world around us. The United States, it is sad. I wish that the world were a peaceful place. We're the biggest economy in the world by a lot, and we're the best economy in the world by a lot, and the best military, and the best diplomacy, and the best economy, and the best leadership, and the best values. And that's why people come to us. That's why people join up with America. As long as we stand for the right things, people will stand with us. I give you that based on my experience, that confidence.
There are a couple of more questions, but I know a summation. I'm not a lawyer, but I know a summation when I hear one, and I think that was a superb one. Some of those questions, again, we're going to send out the video, link to the video, and questions that can be asked of the ambassador directly. Ambassador Gilmore, anything else you'd like to comment on before we say goodnight?
Only that I'm proud to have a chance to be with your listeners. I know about your organization. I know about the people that are engaged with you. I started this conversation by saying that I wanted to speak to leaders. I charge you to do the right thing. The people who are on this call are leaders. You don't just participate in this. You go to other organizations. You go to community organizations. You lead. People look to you for leadership. Lead and do the right thing. And don't fall for this siren song that we're beginning to see of this minority group of people that believe in isolationism. It is the path to destruction. You are capable of stopping that through your leadership.
Ambassador Gilmore, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I know there are other things you could be doing on any given evening, and I know you're usually doing many of them. But we're honored that you could be with us tonight and honored that you could speak to us. Thank all of you for joining us this evening. If you're in Tyson's Corner on the 25th, come on down to Maggiano's and have an Italian meal and hear about the threat of another kind of authoritarianism in the teachers union. And other than that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.